walking towards one of the deadliest forests of World War I, the Bois le Prêtre. The soldiers called it Widowwood or Forest of Death. Between June and September 1915, over 10,000 men died fighting for these 247 acres, which is about 100 hectares. To understand the Bois le Prêtre, you need to understand August 1914. When World War I began, the German army invaded France through Belgium and Luxembourg. By September 1914, they had advanced deep into French territory, but at the Battle of the Marne, the French stopped them. In the region of Lorraine, about 300 kilometers east of Paris, the front line stabilized in late 1914. The town, Pont-à-Mousson, became a French stronghold. About 4 kilometers to the west sat the Bois le Prêtre, a dense forest of about 247 acres. The French held the southeastern edge, the Germans held the northwestern edge. Before the war, this was a peaceful hunting ground, oak and beech forest, thick undergrowth, steep ravines. By spring 1915, it had become something else entirely. The name Witwenwald, the widowwood, didn't appear in any official documents. It was a soldier's slang that spread through letters home. Wives reading these letters understood immediately what their husbands meant. The French High Command wanted this forest, not for strategic value really. The high ground was marginal. But in 1915, French doctrine demanded offensive action. Attack constantly, keep pressure on the Germans, show the nation that France was winning back its territory. So on June 26, 1915, the battle began. What followed was 105 days of continuous combat, close-range fighting in forest terrain, grenade attacks, flamethrowers, bayonet charges for individual trenches. By September, over 10,000 men had died here. French assault doctrine in 1915 emphasized what they called offensive à outrance, which translates to attack to the utmost. The philosophy was that morale and aggressive spirit could overcome defensive firepower. This belief was catastrophically wrong. A typical French attack on the Bois le Prêtre followed a pattern. First came an artillery bombardment that lasted 30 to 60 minutes, then infantry would advance in waves of men with 50-meter spacing between waves. The objective was to reach German trenches and engage with rifle, bayonet and grenade. The expected result was a breakthrough and German retreat. The reality was machine gun fire and artillery response, which caused 50 to 70% casualties before the attacking force even reached the wire. The French command prioritized the use of mines and trench artillery for these forest battles, but the doctrine of constant offensive action didn't change until 1916 after Verdun. So in the Bois le Prêtre, French commanders repeated similar tactics for 10 months. They used the variations of the same method, got similar results, and accumulated mounting casualties. This wasn't stupidity, this was institutional rigidity. This was the inability of military leadership to adapt faster than the technology of killing evolved. This problem would define the entire war. The French advanced about 800 meters in total, half a mile. That's the length of 8 football fields. 10,000 casualties for 8 football fields of destroyed forest. This is Bois le Prêtre, the widow wood, the forest of death, and today it looks like this. 110 years later, the forest has returned. Trees cover everything. Moss, undergrowth, fallen logs. If you don't know what happened here, you walk right through without a second thought. Just ordinary forest. But beneath the surface, the war is still here. Trenches, dugouts, wires, shells. All of it buried under decades of growth. And that's what this exploration is about. Finding what's left. Understanding what happened before it disappears completely. To see what's really left, or rather where to look, I have georeferenced maps from 1915 using QGIS, a specialized program for geographic information systems, short GIS. This process involves aligning historical maps with modern coordinate systems so that they can be accurately compared to present-day geography. By doing this, we can visualize how landscapes, borders and settlements have changed over time. Here we see the final result. As we approach the area from the French side, the georeference map reveals the intricate network of trenches and fortified positions, traces of the front line that once divided this landscape. This is completely different from Verdun, which is about 40 kilometers northwest of here. Verdun has preserved trenches, visitor centers, marked trails, interpretive signs. It's a well-managed historical site where the war is obvious. Thousands of tourists visit every year because the history is presented to them. Here, in the Bois le Prêtre, there's none of that infrastructure. This is just ordinary forest hiding extraordinary history. And that's exactly what this video is about. The reality of searching for battlefields that don't advertise themselves. The unglamorous work of pushing through undergrowth, second-guessing terrain features, and sometimes walking for an hour to find something that looks like not much. Such structures is what I'm looking for. Natural terrain doesn't create formations like that. This is a trench. This was standard French trench design. The zigzag pattern prevented enfilade fire, which meant bullets traveling the length of the trench. Every 8 to 12 meters, French engineers would build these angles. This is basic defensive architecture. French trench engineering evolves rapidly during the Bois le Prêtre campaign. Early French doctrine emphasized temporary fieldworks, the idea being that trenches were just staging points for the next offensive. This proved disastrously inadequate. By August 1915, French engineers were adapting techniques for long-term positional warfare. They began building deeper dugouts, reinforcing walls with timber supports, installing proper drainage systems and so on. The French called these improved positions tranchées de résistance, resistance trenches designed for long-term occupation. One innovation the French developed here was the gagne, a type of dugout specific to forest warfare. Instead of digging straight down into soil, engineers would excavate horizontally into hillsides or ravine walls, creating cave-like shelters that were naturally camouflaged and structurally more stable. But adaptation came at a cost. The 11th Infantry Regiment lost 63 men in 1 week just to trench collapse and construction accidents. Building defenses under artillery fire was as dangerous as combat itself. These French positions, now completely buried in the forest, represent months of engineering work under constant threat. What veterans remembered most about Bois le Prêtre wasn't the violence itself, it was the sound. The forest acted as an acoustic chamber, amplifying and distorting every noise. Artillery shells whistling through trees made sounds soldiers couldn't describe. Branches snapping overhead could be falling limbs or incoming shrapnel. And then there was the silence. After a barrage ended, the forest would go completely quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind, just silence. And in that silence, you'd hear the wounded calling for help from no man's land. Voices you couldn't reach. Voices that would fade over hours or days. One French corporal wrote in his diary, "I prefer the bombardment to the silence. In the noise I cannot think. In the silence I cannot stop thinking." We're now approaching the battlefield through a French support line, which was built in the early weeks of the battle as they pushed northwest into the forest. These French trenches are completely collapsed now, filled in by over a century of erosion and forest growth. Somehow, there's something disturbing about how completely nature erases human conflict. If you walk through this forest casually, you'd never know what happened here. The birds don't care about what occurred. The trees don't remember. Moss grows over everything impartially. Archaeologists call these places conflict landscapes. These are areas of terrain that are permanently marked by violence. Marking isn't always visible to the casual observer, but it's there. It's chemical, it's physical, and it's archaeological. And psychological. French veterans returned here in the 1920s and couldn't orient themselves. The forest they'd fought through no longer existed. The trees were different, the ground was different, the memory of horror had no physical anchor. That disconnection between memory and landscape is why preservation matters. The German trenches, the buried French positions, the wire obstacles, the shell holes are the last physical evidence connecting us to what happened. When they finally erode completely, the war becomes abstract. Just numbers in books, names on memorials, but not lived experience. No visceral reality. The Bois le Prêtre faded from public memory faster than most battlefields. Verdun, just 40 kilometers northwest, became the symbol of French sacrifice. The Somme became the British memorial. The Bois le Prêtre had no such symbolic weight. Part of this was intentional. The French government wanted to move past the war. Reforestation was partly about ecology, but mostly about erasure. Plant trees, let nature heal, forget. Cover the French trenches, let them collapse, let the forest reclaim them. But the veterans didn't forget. Regimental associations returned here annually until the 1960s, even Germans. They'd walk the old trenches, now barely visible. They'd leave small markers, wooden crosses and flowers. Most of those markers are gone now. What remains is this: the buried French positions, the preserved German trenches that we're going to see in a bit, the landscape, the shell holes, the metal in the soil, and the forest that remembers even if we don't. French trench systems followed similar engineering principles to the German systems, though with some differences in execution. They built 3 parallel lines, which were the front line, the support line, and the reserve line. These were spaced 50 to 200 meters apart, which is about 160 to 660 feet. Communication trenches connected them, running perpendicular to the front. Depth was critical for survival. A fighting trench had to be a minimum of 2 meters deep, which is 6.5 feet, though ideally would be 2.5 meters or 8 feet deep. This had to be deep enough that a standing soldier's head stayed below the parapet. The width was typically 60 to 90 centimeters at the bottom, which is 2 to 3 feet, and wider at the top for shoulder room and equipment. But here's the problem with forest fighting. You couldn't dig deep without hitting massive root systems, so trenches in the Bois le Prêtre were often shallow, only 1.2 to 1.5 meters deep, which is 4 to 5 feet. This meant soldiers faced more casualties from artillery because they had less protection. The Bois le Prêtre wasn't the only forest battlefield of World War I. The Argonne forest, 80 kilometers west, had similar terrain and similar casualties. Belleau Wood in 1918 saw US Marines fighting in similar conditions, though on a different scale but with the same fundamental problems. But what distinguished the Bois le Prêtre was the duration and intensity of combat. Argonne battles were mobile and shifting. Belleau Wood lasted 3 weeks. The Bois le Prêtre saw 132 offensive and defensive actions over 10 months of static, attritional combat concentrated in just 247 acres. The casualty density, which is deaths per square meter, was among the highest of any sustained World War I engagement. These shallow trenches I'm walking through were French communications or support trenches. 110 years ago, they would have been full of people, wounded soldiers coming back from the front line looking in the eyes of the unfortunate ones who supply the meat grinder. Over a century of rain and vegetation have filled them in, yet their structures are unmistakable. Walking through them, the ground rises and falls in gentle waves following the path once carved by soldiers in 1914. Every meter you can see fragments of brick, stone and metal among the leaves, the foundations of dugouts or the edges of collapsed shelters. Here, a more substantial structure emerges, around 8 meters or 26 feet of brick trench, partly buried and covered by soil. It could have been a reinforced trench section, or perhaps it was built after the war for forestry purposes. Casualty evacuation in the forest combat was nightmarish. In open terrain, stretcher bearers could work behind the lines relatively safely. In the Bois le Prêtre, everywhere was the front line. Speaking of which, we're now heading towards no man's land. Wounded men often remained in trenches for hours, sometimes for days. Aid stations were just dugouts. They were unsanitary and undersupplied. Infection was nearly universal. Gangrene developed rapidly. Amputation rates were catastrophic, not because wounds necessarily required it, but because medical intervention came too late. German records from July 1915 indicate that of 800 wounded men evacuated from the Bois le Prêtre to field hospitals, 340 died within 72 hours. They didn't die from their wounds directly, they died from shock, infection or blood loss during evacuation. The French experience was similar. One French battalion medical officer wrote that more men die in the forest than on open battlefields, not because of the fighting is worse, but because we cannot reach them in time. This is the hidden arithmetic of widowhood. The official casualty statistics of nearly 14,000 dead don't fully capture the suffering. They don't count those who died unnecessarily because the terrain made mercy impossible. They don't count those who survived physically but not mentally. This forest road crosses the former front line. We are walking in direction of the preserved German positions. 110 years ago, this was a devastated landscape, a no man's land of mud, wire and shell fire. To move through it then would have been almost certain death. This is the northwestern section of the forest where the Germans built their positions into limestone bedrock. Stone doesn't collapse the way soil does, and in some places the Forest Service kept the trenches clear, partly for drainage and partly for historical preservation. These German trenches are the ones that survived. Let's see what they look like. So far, these trenches look similar to the collapsed French positions I found earlier, but there's a difference here. The Germans had time, they built into limestone, and they built to last. This is a German concrete dugout entrance. It's partially collapsed, filled with debris and a century of forest growth, but you can still see the construction. This is reinforced concrete, probably poured in 1915 or early 1916. When you walk around here, the war becomes apparent. The chaos of barbed wire, obstacles, shell craters and partially destroyed trenches alone makes this abundantly clear. In the green forest, everything seems rather picturesque. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like 110 years ago. German records provide a different perspective on the Bois le Prêtre. To the Germans, this wasn't about territorial gain, this was about attrition. Every meter the French advanced cost them casualties they couldn't afford. The German strategy was simple: hold, counterattack, make every tree costly. One German battalion commander wrote that the Bois le Prêtre was not a forest but a graveyard we are forced to tend. His regiment held the same 300-meter section for 89 days, suffering 60% casualties but never retreating. German concrete dugouts in the Bois le Prêtre followed standardized specifications: minimum depth, 3 meters underground, which is about 10 feet, though many went deeper up to 5 meters or 16 feet. The concrete walls were typically 30 to 40 centimeters thick, which is 12 to 16 inches, reinforced with steel rebar when available. The corrugated metal roofing served dual purposes. It provided structural support for the concrete arch and created an air gap that helped absorb the shock from shell impacts above. The entrance was always angled or had a sharp turn, just inside to prevent shell fragments from ricocheting directly into the chamber. Construction time varied. A crew of 8 to 12 men could build one of these in about 2 weeks, working primarily at night to avoid French artillery observation. They'd excavate first, then build wooden formwork, pour the concrete in sections and install the metal roofing before the concrete fully cured. That's when they'd carve their names. This is their signature, their attempt at permanence in a place where nothing felt permanent, where survival was measured in hours. The Germans had advantages here. They held the higher ground on the northwestern edge. They had better developed dugout systems because they'd occupied the forest first and built into the limestone bedrock, which is why their trenches survived. Their artillery had pre-registered coordinates for every approach route. But they also suffered. One German soldier's letter described watching French flamethrowers advance on July 4, 1915, and being unable to retreat because doing so meant abandoning wounded comrades trapped in dugouts. He wrote, "We stayed and died, or we stayed and somehow survived. There was no third option." This is a German fighting trench. This trench is still open after 110 years. The walls are made out of concrete, but what's remarkable is the preservation of detail. After the initial offensives, the front became static. This was positional warfare, guerre de position. Both sides dug extensive trench networks for protection. The trench lines were connected by communication trenches, allowing movement of men, wounded and supplies. In some sectors, like at the Croix de Carmes, the opposing lines were sometimes only 20 meters apart, which is about 65 feet. The dense forest made organized linear movement impossible. Both armies launched repeated assaults to push back the enemy and gain small amounts of ground. The commands prioritized the use of mines and trench artillery. The French deployed a new weapon here called the lance-flamme, a portable flamethrower. The Germans responded with their own flamethrowers. On July 4, 1915, the Germans launched a major flamethrower attack. Both sides also used poison gas in these battles. Artillery was employed extensively. Numerous accounts from soldiers describe how shells wreaked havoc, shredding the undergrowth, felling trees, and splintering even the thickest trunks. This perspective is what helps you understand the vulnerability soldiers faced. Artillery lands above and fragments ricochet down the trench walls. The only protection was dugouts or these built-in features. Another concrete dugout. Someone carved this by hand. A German soldier, probably aged 19 to 25, using an entrenching tool or pickaxe. This was his workspace. His life was reduced to 70 centimeters of width and whatever depth he could dig for protection. German writer Ernst Toller fought here in the Bois le Prêtre. Years later, he wrote about his experiences.
The French and German trenches run through one of these shot-up forests, which are decaying all over Europe, the Priesterwald. We are so close to each other that if we stuck our heads out of the trenches, we could talk to each other without raising our voices. We sleep huddled together in muddy shelters, water dripping from the walls, rats gnawing at our bread, the war in our homeland gnawing at our sleep. Today there are 10 of us. Tomorrow there will be 8. 2 have been torn apart by grenades. We do not bury our dead. We place them in the small niches carved into the trench wall for us to rest. When I crouch down and creep through the trench, I do not know whether I am passing a dead man or a living one. Here the corpses and the living have the same gray-yellow faces.
Toller survived the war but took his life in 1939. As it is said, he never forgot the forest. The barbed wire you could see throughout the video is over 100-year-old steel. It's oxidized but still dangerous. The French would have faced not just this single line but multiple belts of wire when they attacked these positions. In some places these obstacles extended 20 to 30 meters deep, which is 65 to 100 feet. Attacking through this wire required wire cutters, but cutting made noise and drew fire. Or you could use artillery to blow up gaps in the wire, but that warned the defenders an assault was coming. Or you could use flamethrowers to burn paths through it, but flamethrower operators had a life expectancy of minutes in combat. There was no good solution to this problem, there were only terrible options. This is the Croix des Carmes memorial. It marks the most contested point in the entire Bois le Prêtre. The original Croix des Carmes was a wooden wayside cross at a trail junction common in Catholic Lorraine. During the battle, this junction became a tactical objective where multiple communication trenches converged. This stone memorial was erected after the war by French veterans associations. It incorporates or represents the destroyed cross and lists units that fought here. The Croix des Carmes became a symbol of the intimate, brutal nature of forest combat. This memorial stands where the men fought and died across a gap they could see but couldn't safely cross. The major fighting officially ended on September 15, 1915, through smaller actions continued into early 1916. The French had advanced approximately 800 meters northwest, which is about half a mile. German lines held on the northwestern edge. Both sides declared victory. Both sides were lying. The final tally was horrific. In just 10 months, 132 offensive and defensive actions were fought. French dead 7,083, German dead 6,982, nearly 14,000 men killed for no gain really, and 247 acres of forest. Reforestation began in the 1920s. This was intentional replanting, primarily oak and beech trees. The French government wanted to erase the scars and restore normalcy, but you can't erase war by planting trees. The soil chemistry changed permanently. There's too much iron from shrapnel and too much lime from the destroyed equipment. Certain plant species won't grow here even now, a century later. The war never really ended here. It just went underground. This is the Bois le Prêtre French military cemetery. There are 2,873 graves here. Most of the graves here are identified. They show the name, rank, regiment and date of death, but 387 are unknown. These graves just say inconnu, which means unknown. These were men found in the forest, sometimes decades later, whose identification was impossible. The Bois le Prêtre isn't famous like Verdun. There's no visitor center here, there are no guided tours. Most people drive past without knowing what happened in this forest. But that's what makes places like this important. Not every battlefield becomes a memorial, not every sacrifice gets a monument. Sometimes history survives only in the landscape. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. The Bois le Prêtre isn't an easy place to explore or an easy story to tell, but places like this matter. Drop a comment and let me know what lesser known battlefield or fortification you'd like to see explored. I read every comment and I take suggestions seriously. If you want to see more explorations of forgotten World War I battlefields, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I've got more locations planned across Europe. Trenches, forts, bunkers, places where the war is still visible if you know where to look.